when we see an advertisement that says Teslas are carbon free, that's a lie. It takes a lot of carbon to build a Tesla. It takes a lot of mining in the third world where the Tesla drivers in Boulder never see the consequences of not having environmental laws where over the horizon. We should have a level playing field when you find out that the carbon footprint of a Tesla is equal to the carbon footprint of a little gas-powered sports car that gets a very high, like 40 miles to the gallon. Now, there's an equivalency there. The carbon input of making the Tesla is as great over the life of the Tesla as the carbon input of making that car and burning a little bit of fossil fuel.
The last thing you want to hear are two old white guys talking about measuring something, because that just never goes well. But my friend Ed Warner is a scientist, and measuring is a big deal. That's how you made your businesses. What is this?
I don't normally give talks on science with props, but this is my 1963 scientific slide rule. This is what we did to make calculations so that if I had an experiment where I had to get a grade about how much salt was dissolved in water, and I had to go through a whole series of 2 weeks of measurements and calculations, I actually did it on this device called a scientific slide rule.
When my kid goes to math class now, or calculus, she has to buy this special calculator. Oh, Dad, I got to buy this one. The calculator does this. This was the calculator when you went to school.
Yes.
I've seen it. I played with it. I was able to do like simple math or addition or multiplication on it. This is just ridiculous.
Well, if you pull that other end out, you can use it to scratch your back.
Yeah,
that's about as good as it is today.
I remember the nuns would occasionally use this
So for those who are not mathematically inclined, this enabled you to see a little narrow line. And if you had really good eyesight, you might get back to 1/10 or 100th of a percent.
Right, because there's a little line on this thing you slide.
So 10.1 is 2 parts. 10.3, 3 orders of magnitude. And if you had to do 6 different calculations on the way to getting to how much salt was dissolved in water, your accuracy was down to 10.1% at most if you were lucky. And that's as accurate as we would get. We had something that we analyzed and we said it was measured in parts per mil. That's 1 part in 1,000. So John, let's just say, as one of these Einstein thought experiments that I love, somebody comes to you, government agency, and says, there is something dissolved in your drinking water, and it's 1 part per million, but it's safe. And you're going to go, oh, that's a really small amount. It's okay. I can get that, right?
Yeah.
And then another government bureaucrat or some kind of environmental advocate comes along and says, John, you're going to die, because there's 1,000,000 parts per trillion of this stuff in your water. And you say, oh my God, 1,000,000 parts per what?
That would get my attention, even though it's the same thing.
They're the same damn thing. They're equivalent. And so what we found is science has gotten more and more accurate during my lifetime. We've gone from a part per 1,000 to a part per million to a part per billion to a part per trillion to maybe as little as 1/100th of a part per trillion. So can I explain what 1/100th of a part per trillion looks like?
Yeah.
Because I love talking science to non-scientists.
You can call me an idiot. You want to be the first.
No, you're a liberal arts kind of guy, and I love the arts as well as the sciences. So you're on a beach, right? A beautiful sandy beach made out of tiny little grains of sand, right? And all of a sudden, your sojourn looking at bikinis and maybe getting a sunburn is disturbed by a giant dump truck that drives along the beach, and a crane and a shovel dumps an entire load into this giant 20-ton truck, right? And I walk along and say, oh, hi, John, it's your nerd scientist friend, Ed. Let me show you something. Put out your hand. And I take 1 grain of sand and I put it in your palm. That is one part in 1/100th of a trillion. The difference between the grain of sand and the truck filled to its brim. So people don't understand what this means. They don't understand that we're actually down to counting individual atoms now. And we can be more accurate in science, which may help us with safety. There's a part to this that's good. We can date the ages of things that have happened by something called radiometric dating. Everybody knows carbon-14.
Right.
In 50,000 years, there's no more carbon-14 because half of it disappears every 5,500 years. But uranium is 4.5 billion years for half of uranium to be left as lead. So there's very different ages, right? And so I can tell you right now that the dinosaurs were killed off by an asteroid that hit in what is now the Gulf of Mexico, just north of Yucatan, 66 million, 12,000 years ago, plus or minus about the same time between us and Jesus in human time. And
wait. You can tell me when the asteroid hit
that
within 2,000 years.
That 2,000 out of 66 million. That's pretty accurate. And we're getting more accurate. I can also tell you by a different type of science that the day it happened, the crispy critter event, it was springtime.
How do you know this? How could you possibly know that?
Because there's pollen everywhere. Pollen and fern spores everywhere. And they flower in the springtime, even 66 million years ago. And what we found with the crispy critter dinosaurs and the charred surface was springtime diversity of pollen and spores.
That's amazing.
And we can look at every year of sediments and say, this was winter, this was summer, this was winter, this was summer, this was wet, this was dry. That's how accurate we've gotten. So the yin of positive science is we've gotten really, really more accurate. And the yang of that is that we can now actually manipulate the public. The public doesn't understand numbers enough. So that if it's safe to have a trace of lead in the water, and the EPA says that there is no amount of lead that's safe, that can't be true. Because we can measure 1/10 trillionth of a part of lead in water. And that cannot harm a human being who lives 1,000 years and drinks 2 gallons a day. So we can be manipulated by what we think of scientific.
I see this in environmental reporting all the time. The government will purchase some, plug-in station or some regulation they pass, and they'll say, this is going to remove, 10 tons of carbon, every year. And I go, that sounds incredible. But they never give it to me as a percentage of what is created. In other words, if this program costs me $1 billion a year and takes away 10 tons of carbon, what are we buying as a percentage of all the carbon? And they never do that.
That's
as
right.
A percentage. It'd be like looking at the national debt and saying, well, we owe this much. Compared to what? Well, it's over a year's worth of GDP. That's important to know. So how do we look at those numbers to say when they're giving, first of all, how do we recognize when they're giving us a number without giving us any sort of context as to what that number means?
So, and that I've been advocating for this for a long time, that we need to be able to explain to the public on a level playing field type of science and intellect, not dumbing it down necessarily. But when we see an advertisement that says Teslas are carbon free, that's a lie. It takes a lot of carbon to build a Tesla. It takes a lot of mining in the third world where the Tesla drivers in Boulder never see the consequences of not having environmental laws where over the horizon. We call them NIMBYs, of course, and I love to pick on them. So we should have a level playing field when you find out that the carbon footprint of a Tesla is equal to the carbon footprint of a little gas-powered sports car that gets a very high, like 40 miles to the gallon. Now, there's an equivalency there. The carbon input of making the Tesla is as great over the life of the Tesla as the carbon input of making that car and burning a little bit of fossil fuel.
To keep it going.
We don't have this level playing field.
The electricity to fuel, the fuel for the Tesla is also not carbon neutral. It puts out a lot of emissions. When you see a coal train, you should say, "Oh, look, Tesla fuel." That's what you see.
I was driving a little red sports car, brand new. I had parking karma, so it ended up at the window of the bar. I had worked with the Nature Conservancy, get speakers into the Denver Science Museum, and they invited me to have drinks, and then we're all going to go over there together. And of course, the fundraiser saw the little sports car and said, "Oh, Ed, can I go in it with you?" And one of their very good-looking, incredibly well-dressed Boulder socialite board members looked at me with arrogance and said, "Why didn't you buy a Tesla?" And I said, "Because of the carbon footprint." And it was like I slapped her in the face. And then I did the math for her. Your Tesla gets the equivalent of 57 miles to the gallon gas equivalents. Mine gets 37, but mine is primary fuel directly from oil.
Right.
It takes 10% of the energy to make the gasoline that I burn in my sports car. Your Tesla's electricity, whatever the number is, 40% comes from coal, 20% comes from natural gas. That's all a big carbon footprint, one bigger than the other. And then there's the power loss down the line to get it from the Cherokee power plant outside of Sea Springs all the way to Boulder. Unless you have all your own solar cells and all your own windmills and all your own chargers.
How much power as a percentage do you lose transmitting power across the state?
In 100 miles, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's at least 20%. There's big power loss down power lines. And then, of course, the whole footprint. And then, not being satisfied, because I was on a mission then, I looked her in the eye and I said, "And then there's the lithium batteries." And she understood it. And she said, "You're right. There's a problem with the batteries." And I said, "Okay, here's one of these Einstein thought experiments that I love. Let's say that you could raise a magic wand and you could say, this is the perfect place to have a lithium mine. Bink. Where would that be?" And of course, she's going like deer in headlamps by then, right? And I said, "Boulder County, Colorado." Forget about the geology. Think about the environmental laws. We have the best in the world. There are no environmental laws in the Congo, where I've seen water poisoned by copper that is poisoning all the native villages. There are no environmental laws there, right? What about Boulder? If you had a lithium mine in Boulder, you'd make sure it wasn't screwed up.
Could you imagine how expensive lithium would be if mined in a place like Boulder with hyper NIMBYism, hyper regulation, hyper environmental laws?
This is a thought experiment. Come on.
It's beautiful.
But another board member, whose gender will not be described, leans across and says, "I've never thought of it like that." And that's the conversation we need to have. We need a level playing field. We have to know the carbon footprint of a wind turbine. The environmental impact of wind turbines. They kill a lot of birds, a lot of raptors, and yet the greenies won't even talk about it because it's green energy. Solar cells were put out in the Mojave Desert. I visited the site. The Obama administration had a law on the books called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and you have to do an environmental assessment, an environmental impact study, an EIS. And the Obama administration waived it for that solar field, even though it was 8,000 acres of prime endangered species desert tortoise
You're
habitat.
kidding me. Now, I remember doing EIS studies at my time at RTD, which is, well, we're going to put a rail line over, and you've got to do an EIS. What is the environmental impact? So they put solar panels up, which are made of something, and I don't know what they're made of, without an EIS. You could take that amount of land because it's special.
Gophorus agassizi,
Wow.
the desert Mojave desert tortoise. It's one of the few scientific names I know because I had one as a pet for it's still alive. It must be 75 or 100 years old now because I'm 79. These things need to have burrows, which are really bad, breaking people's legs, and they need to have sunlight to grow the plants that they eat. And when you put down solar like that, you basically keep anything from growing underneath it. It takes all the sunlight out of it. But that's not even the point. There was no level playing field. Obama administration was so excited to say yes to a solar field that they couldn't have cared less about the environmental consequences under this environmental law that all of us, whether it was RTD or oil and gas, had to abide by.
Let me ask you this one, though. And I've gotten into these fights with folks from like COPERG and other, I'll say, nutty organizations where they say, you know, that car you're driving, you're not putting the real cost on that car because not only do you have the environmental cost of this, this, and this, what about the cost of your garage? What about the cost of your driveway? Those are also automobile costs. And we need to, if we're going to compare to transit, we're going to need to say how much your car costs in your driveway and all that. I mean, just really, really crazy. If you're saying we're going to do a comparison, who gets to decide what gets measured and what doesn't get measured? Because I think the environmental nuts will always find a way to rig the system.
It's a really good point. And the answer is that considering the politics of this country and the amount of advocacy and lobbying involved, getting a level playing field is one of my Pollyanna ideas. It's virtually impossible. On the other hand, we don't need everything down to the nanometer, the tiniest measurement that we can make. We can actually make ballpark estimates of things to get an idea of what good we can do versus what it can cost. As an example, and I know we've talked about carbon in the atmosphere and how stupid it is us to spend billions of our wealth when the Chinese are building coal-fired plants faster than we can get rid of carbon. So it's a dumb approach because we don't have control of the entire world, and this is a world-sized issue. But how about the idea that lobbying and the politics of America would rather finance a $3 billion plant to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at an estimated cost of $12,000 a ton, when we can subsidize farmers just a little bit to do a different kind of farming, which will ultimately make more money for them. Just give them a little upfront so that you rebuild carbon in the soils. From 3%, it's been eroded down to 1% and back up to 2 or 3% at a cost of about $20 a ton instead of $12,000. It's using the marketplace. And it is front-end loading an expense.
Because the government has nothing to do with the marketplace.
They have nothing to win.
Right.
And lobbyists have nothing to win and a lot to lose. We have a corrupt country. We are just like Zimbabwe. We have gangsters in government. They're being bribed. A lot of that is lobbying. And it's not just golf trips.
And it's also the bureaucratic incentive. Randall O'Toole, one of the environmental experts at Independence Institute, is an expert on forest management. It is what he's into. And amazingly, I know this is going to surprise you, when forests are managed by private operators that own the land, they grow trees to harvest, let's say, they manage them incredibly. They clean them. They make sure there's not a fire danger. But the Forest Service gets rewarded when they fail. They don't groom the forests. Forest fires come, inflame the entire state, and they go to Congress and go, well, we just don't have money. And so by failing, they get more money, which only encourages them to fail more.
There's a institute out of Maine run by a fellow that I admire because he thinks outside the box. And I saw the pre-publication of a very long research project on a bunch of different environmental issues. And of course, I speed read. So I was burning through this damn,
of course you speed read,
78 pages or whatever it was. And I am big on maps. My brain remembers maps more than the written word. And all of a sudden, I flew through a couple of maps, and it was like hitting the brakes in your sports car when you're going 120 miles an hour. I was skidding down the mental highway, starting to spin out, right? Because I saw this. It was a map of the US of forests. Forget about first generation or second generation or any stuff. It's just forested land across the entire US, from the West Coast to the East Coast. And it shows that there are more forests in the Southeast than there are in the West. Yeah, big shock, right? You didn't know this. Starting from the Mississippi River in Missouri and Arkansas, all the way to Georgia and the Southern Pines, there's more forests. The difference between the East and the West is almost all of it is private forest from the Mississippi River east, and almost all of it is government owned from the Kansas border. The prairies don't matter because there are no trees, to the West Coast. And then the third part of this was fire. And you see a map of forest fires, and virtually all the fires are in the West, where it's managed by government. And where it's privately managed, exactly to your point, there are almost no forest fires. And some wit could say, oh, well, it's wetter in Georgia, right? Oh, no. In this time frame that this data was gathered, the Southeast went through the biggest drought in their history. Remember that? Atlanta was going to run out of water, municipal water. Everything was burning up. Excuse me, it's about management. If a property is owned privately, it will be protected. If a property is owned publicly, it's the tragedy of the commons writ large. Government employees do not care as much about public lands as a private landowner with 50 acres of oak trees in Missouri.
We often talk about the massive regulatory and actual cash subsidies for feel-good energy. And I've gotten into these debates, and the anti-fossil fuel folks go, oil has subsidies too. When you pressure them, it's like, what subsidy are you talking about? The answer I've always gotten was, well, you're drilling and taking fossil fuels from public lands, and the fee you pay the government is so much less than what they pay to private landowners. I made the suggestion, well, then we should sell the public land, and then you will have a true market price for that extraction, and then you'll be happy. They were not happy.
Well, it's also the difference between nimble private enterprise, like farmers who own their minerals, and absolutely static, mismanaged and static government management. So all minerals were rented out in the good old days at a 12.5% royalty. It's a 1/8 royalty. It's the British system, so our numbers are kind of weird, right? So a farmer who decided to rent his land to an oil company got 12.5% right off the top as a royalty as income.
Wait, let me see if I'm following you. Farmers care about the top of his land. That's where he makes his money. Some oil company goes, I think there's oil underneath it. If we drill here, we'll give you 1/8 of what we make.
That's right.
Okay.
an eighth royalty.
It's a royalty. All
Right. And that's why the royalties on federal lands are 1/8 royalty. That's where this comes from, out of old English common law mining
Right.
and extraction, kinds of concepts, right? Well, guess what? The state of Wyoming, which is a big oil and gas state, if you rent from the state, if you lease a state land, even back in 1990, it was 18 7/8. It wasn't 12 1/2.
They charge more.
They're smarter than the federal government. And then if you were a private landowner and there was a huge play, you could get a ton of money up front. It was called a signing bonus, just like a football player. You get a chunk of money in the bank right now for the rights to do something later. And then they were negotiating 15% royalties, 17 1/2, 18 3/4, 20%, 25%. And if that environmentalist says the government, you're getting subsidized, that's nonsense. Blame it on the government bureaucracy. Don't blame it on the company that's leasing from the government. The government makes the terms.
But if we sold the land, then oil and gas companies would be paying more to suck out and extract those minerals.
Damn right they would. Look,
Then why don't they want to privatize the land and sell it off?
because this is really going to get me in trouble. There is no public land in this country. There is government land and there is private land. I have been threatened by arrest when I was legally doing geology on federal land in Wyoming by an arrogant engineer that didn't even know that my name was on the government lease. He was trying to arrest me for driving down a dirt track in the middle of really nowhere. And I said, okay, let's see. There is false imprisonment, right? And there's and you're really going to arrest me without even knowing who I am? And then I said, why don't we go back to your office? And it was in Pinedale, Wyoming at the time. And we'll look in the file of leases. And you're going to find 4 names. And one of them is Edward M. Warner, not some corporation. It's in my own personal name. And the guy looked at me and he knew he had stepped in it seriously. But what if I wasn't? What if I was just a stranger who wanted to botanize across the land, which is totally legal?
Botanize?
Yeah, go and look at wildflowers.
All right. Bird watching for
Yes,
plants.
all of that stuff. I was actually doing field geology and I had every right to do it. But that's the arrogance of a government bureaucrat. So when they say this is public land, I want you to translate that, the public. This is our land. This is Bureau of Land Management land. This is Forest Service land. This is BUREC land. This is National Park. This is our land. It is not public land. They don't treat it like it is the public's land. Get me in a lot of trouble.
All right. So as we look at measurements, finishing up where we started, we've gotten a lot more accurate since the days of this. Give me some good news about that accuracy. What is, now that nobody knows how to use this, it'll be like cursive. It'll be a code that parents use to make sure their kids can't read the notes.
Well, one of the greatest developments in our lifetimes is taking a signal from space and directing it right into a smart device or any computer wired into a car. And that car can be driven down the road and directed to within a fraction of an inch. So the old GPS technology that was developed by the military decades and decades ago, the public was not allowed to use that accurately. They degraded the signal for public use because they did not want to actually allow the enemy, whether it was the Soviets or the Chinese, to figure out what technology we were doing. Because you can back calculate how accurate the signal is to how you were doing it, right? So they wanted, because that was the military Cold War stuff, right? As soon as they said, okay, because the pressure was on them, that we're going to let go of that and you can use these military satellites. And then you can do Starlink, and then you can do all kinds of private enterprise stuff. All of a sudden, we could improve safety in cars dramatically. I decided to go to lunch today, right? And I plugged in the name of the restaurant, and Gretchen in that little computer of mine told me where to go.
Not only that,
this is fabulous technology.
Not only that, you can go back into the backwoods on those government land, and if you're in trouble, you can actually now know where you are and use a satellite to
rescue yourself. Yeah. Sure. So search and rescue.
Not that I've ever needed that.
Well, I'm a geologist, so I don't. I know how to survive in the backcountry. I've done it, but it's great. It saves lives, right? It saves a lot of lives. It also it creates a commerce that we never had before. It's hugely beneficial for us as a society. And by the way, people are using this in Africa. Right. In the darkest Africa with the least technology, nonsense. All of this technology that is based on more accurate measurement, right?
More accurate measurement of spectrum as well.
Spectrum. How about the accuracy of technology, right? We have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? We have figured out how to make things so tiny, we couldn't even measure them in the past. Now we do this without even thinking about it. And we have the capacity to go from a supercomputer when I was in college that took up an entire building and it was used by the Army, to try and generate some Cold War data, right? Your cell phone now has more power, no less your laptop, than the supercomputers of 20 or 30 years ago.
The leapfrogging that happens, particularly for developing nations, is amazing. So we have telephone systems, lots of wires, lots of copper, connecting everybody's house, everybody's building, everybody's office. That goes to switching stations, that goes to switching stations, And some poor nation goes, we'll never be able to afford that infrastructure. And then along comes a satellite or Starlink, and you don't need that infrastructure. They are now able to join the real world at light speed without having to build out that crap.
Just 20, 30 years ago, academia was telling us that there's going to be this incredible crisis because we're going to run out of copper because the third world was going to have to copperize their communication system, and they never saw this coming. Well, guess what? That's one of the problems with having a fixed view of the world. And the marketplace doesn't have a fixed view. That's what's so beautiful about it. So that a country in Africa can go from no infrastructure in the way of phones to cell phones and communication that's now being used for business.
For banking.
For business. Every entrepreneur I saw in Africa was holding a cell phone.
All right, wrap it up for me. The lesson of the evolution of measurements means what?
It's the yin and the yang of humanity. Nobel produced dynamite to save lives and minds, and it was used to make artillery shells. So he saved thousands of miners, and we killed tens of millions of people. It's the yin and the yang of entrepreneurial development. Oh my. And so let's not be afraid of AI. Will something bad come out of it? It's possible, but a lot of good will come out of it. Will a lot of good come out of these very, very intense measurements that we can make now? Yes. And will bad stuff come out of it? Will we be manipulated by people who don't think we're smart enough to know the difference, that you shouldn't be scared by 1 part per trillion when it's the same as 1 part per million?
How about this? Protect yourself by learning how percentages work. And whenever you see a news story that has a raw number, but not compared to something, you know somebody's selling you propaganda, not news. Ed, always I learn something. Thank you so much.
I'm not going to shake hands either because I know we're not allowed to do that, but I am mentally shaking hands, John. It's such a pleasure to talk with you.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.